The champagne bottle slipped from the flight attendant's hand and shattered across the first-class cabin floor, all because of one sentence spoken softly, as mist yet heavy as a hammer blow. "I am the new owner of this airline." The sound of breaking glass rippled into a thin web across the floor as silence swallowed every movement. The passengers' faces tightened, like strings stretched to the point of snapping, and the crew, the very people who believed they controlled the most exclusive cabin in the sky, suddenly looked as if they had been dropped into the wrong universe. But that sentence was only the ending of a journey that had begun hours earlier, a journey where Daniel Carter, the man mistaken for someone who did not belong, carried in his pocket the power to rewrite the entire sky. 4 hours earlier, at Boston Airport, Daniel stepped out of a black SUV wearing a simple jacket and clean but worn sneakers, his posture modest, his appearance unassuming. No one could have guessed that this 39-year-old man with a gentle smile was the one running Apex Cyber Systems, a $13 billion tech empire. Daniel never dressed like a billionaire because he never needed to. He had grown up in the lowest corners of society, cramped apartments in Atlanta, where windows creaked and where his mother worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. Wealth came to him through intellect and grit, but the memory of poverty was something he refused to abandon. It kept him humble, kept him grounded, kept him human. That was why he usually flew economy, blending into everyday life, reminding himself that the people he served through Apex were not CEOs, but millions of ordinary people like his mother. Today, however, was an exception. His assistant had informed him that his usual flight was cancelled, and the only remaining option was a first-class seat on Aurora Air, an airline whispered about for its subtle forms of discrimination. Daniel simply smiled because the truth was he had been quietly negotiating to purchase Aurora Air for the past 6 months, not for prestige, but to rebuild a system that had rotted from the inside. He wanted to change it from within, and to do that, he had to witness the problem with his own eyes. The check-in counter was packed. The agent, a young woman named Sarah, greeted the white man in front of Daniel with a bright smile. "Welcome, thank you for flying with Aurora Air. Please proceed to the priority gate." With a single glance at her screen, she waved him through without asking for a second ID, without scrutiny, without suspicion. When Daniel stepped forward, the smile vanished. "May I see another form of identification?" "Please." "Here is my passport," he replied. "I will need additional verification." Sarah tilted her head, flipping through the passport as if searching for hidden wrongdoing. Her eyes did not see him as a customer, but as someone who needed to be controlled. Daniel felt a familiar sting in his chest, a feeling he had known all his life, in grocery stores, in banks, in places where respect should have been standard, but somehow became conditional on skin color. He asked gently, "Is there a problem?" Sarah gave an awkward smile. No, this is just required procedure." Both of them knew that this procedure applied only to him. As he waited, Daniel remembered what his mother once told him before he left for college. "The higher you climb, the more people will try to pull you down, but never lose your kindness. That is the one thing they can never take from you." He had kept that promise for a long time, but Aurora Air was already testing it. Finally, Sarah reluctantly returned his documents. "You may proceed." The white man behind Daniel, the same one who had breezed through earlier, muttered loudly enough, "Unbelievable, always someone slowing things down." Daniel ignored him. He was not here to argue. He was here to see the sky clearly before he changed it. The first-class cabin was luxurious, with cream leather seats, soft golden lighting, and a faint scent of warm wood. But the moment Daniel placed his luggage down, a sharp voice cut through the air behind him. "Excuse me, you are in my seat." Daniel turned. Philip Carson, immaculately dressed with an expensive watch, stared at him with irritation, as if Daniel's existence itself were out of place. Daniel replied calmly, "Seat 2. I believe this is my seat." Philip snorted and lifted his chin. "I always sit in 2A on this route. Are you sure you belong in that seat?" The question was not about seating. It was about him. Lauren Pierce, the lead flight attendant, approached. The look she gave Daniel lacked the warm professionalism found in first class, and instead carried a hint of annoyance, maybe even caution. "May I see your ticket, please?" Daniel handed it to her immediately. She studied it longer than necessary before finally saying, "You are assigned to 2A." Yet instead of apologizing to Daniel, she turned to Philip with a sympathetic smile. "I am terribly sorry, sir. It seems the system reassigned the seat at the last minute." Daniel said nothing as he sat down, but that dull ache in his chest returned again, the feeling of being seen as someone who didn't belong regardless of the ticket in his hand, regardless of the fact that he was about to own the entire airline. But that was something they would learn soon enough, and when they did, it would be too late. As the aircraft doors closed, Daniel opened his laptop and reviewed the final documents for the share acquisition. The number 51% glowed on the screen like a quiet promise from the moment he signed this sky would belong to him. Outside, the sun dipped toward the horizon, and inside, Daniel prepared for a flight he knew would be unlike any other. If he had known what was waiting for him ahead, the insults, the stares, the quiet acts of discrimination, perhaps he would have armored his heart more firmly. But Daniel Carter lived by his mother's words. People never see your true value until you make them look, and they were about to look, very clearly, very soon, because in just a few hours the man they dismissed would rise and tear off the mask Aurora Air had worn for years. The first-class cabin seemed quiet, yet every small movement carried a cold undercurrent Daniel felt clearly. Lauren Pierce pushed the drink cart down the aisle, her smile blooming effortlessly each time she stopped beside a white passenger. "Welcome back, Mr. Davidson. Wonderful to see you again, Mrs. Reynolds." She lifted sparkling champagne with a graceful tilt, leaning in with the warmth reserved for the most prestigious guests in the world. But as the cart passed, seat 2A, that smile disappeared completely. No greeting, no offer of a drink, not even the most basic nod of courtesy. Daniel looked up with a calm expression. Lauren avoided his eyes and continued toward the next passenger, who had barely settled into his seat without fastening his belt, yet already had a chilled glass of champagne in hand. Daniel exhaled softly, not out of anger but out of familiarity. Across from him, Greg Thompson watched with a conflicted look, as if he wanted to say something but swallowed it back. Anna Park, an Asian American executive in the row beside him, glanced over with quiet sympathy. She did not smile, but the understanding in her small nod was enough to let Daniel know he was not imagining any of this. Behind him, Lauren's voice rose along with a soft laugh. "You can tell he is not used to sitting here," another attendant answered with a muffled giggle. The words were not directed at him, yet sharp enough to cut and loud enough for him to hear every syllable. Daniel leaned back in his seat, heart steady, breath controlled. He had lived through far worse moments than this, but the sting in his chest, the disappointment in people, never fully disappeared. Mark Holloway, the purser, approached with strained politeness. "Sir, I heard there was a misunderstanding about your seat earlier. We want all first-class passengers to feel comfortable. If you feel this cabin is not a good fit, we can arrange a seat for you in business." The meaning beneath the words was unmistakable. He did not belong here. Daniel looked up, his voice steady and soft. "I am fine here. I just want to be served the same as the other passengers." Mark smiled, but his eyes remained frozen cold as carved stone. "Of course, we will keep that in mind." But Daniel knew they would not. They were only keeping one thing in mind, the fact that he existed in this cabin at all. The aircraft began to taxi, the warm, golden lights shifting into takeoff mode. Daniel placed his hand on his laptop and opened the Aurora Air Share transfer documents. The digital pages appeared like layers of windows, revealing a truth no one in this cabin could imagine. In a few hours, the rules they relied on so comfortably would no longer apply to him. But Daniel didn't smile. He did not feel triumphant. He felt only a strange stillness, the kind of stillness a lake has right before a storm that people unknowingly stir up for themselves. Lauren returned to the cabin again, pouring champagne for the last two passengers. As she walked past Daniel's seat, he spoke gently. "Excuse me, may I have a glass of champagne?" Lauren paused for half a second, then forced her lips into a thin smile. "I will check if we have any left." She pushed the cart forward without looking back. Daniel watched her, a faint flicker of cold sharpness appearing in his eyes, small but unmistakable. A shift subtle, yet deep like a hidden door in his mind, opening quietly. There were things he had held back for a very long time, and some things once pushed by the right person would never return to the way they were. And Lauren Pierce had just pushed exactly that. The first meal of the flight was announced by the warm scent of melted butter drifting through the cabin, but when Lauren Pierce approached Daniel's seat, that warmth instantly hardened into something cold and heavy. She glanced at her notes, then at Daniel, with a puzzled expression, as if his presence alone had disrupted the familiar order of first class. "Today we have seared salmon or grilled tenderloin," she said in a flat tone, her eyes avoiding his. Daniel answered clearly and politely, "I'll have the tenderloin medium rare." Lauren lifted the lid of a tray, peeked inside, then shut it far too quickly to be believable. "Sorry, we're out." From across the aisle, Greg Thompson raised an eyebrow because, at the exact moment, she said, "We're out another attendant." Zach was placing a steaming plate of tenderloin in front of a white passenger, just a few seats away. Greg glanced at Daniel with a flicker of frustration on his behalf. But Daniel did not react immediately. He looked straight at Lauren, his voice soft but firm. "I just saw him being served that dish." Lauren didn't blink. That was the last one. Her response came too fast, too rehearsed. Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying the half-smile on her face, the kind of smile born not from courtesy, but from the belief that people like him would never dare to challenge her. He placed 2 fingers on his phone and tapped once. The recording mode activated in silence. Lauren did not notice or did not imagine he would do such a thing. "Then I'll take the salmon," Daniel said, his tone steady and deep, although inside him a thin fracture was beginning to spread. Lauren nodded and pushed the cart forward. But seconds later, he heard her voice, coming from the galley, low, but not low enough. "Told you. You can tell he's not the type who belongs in first class." Zack chuckled. Yeah. Looks like he used someone's voucher. A suffocating pause followed. Greg Thompson shook his head. Anna Park set her pen down, her gaze heavy, as though she had heard this kind of thing far too often on business flights. Daniel's breathing remained even. No outburst, no reaction. He simply let their words slide neatly into the recording on his phone. When Lauren returned and placed the salmon in front of him, Daniel looked at the plate and stayed silent for a few seconds. The fish was cold, the vegetables wilted, the portion noticeably smaller than what other passengers had received. Yet Lauren asked, with a tone that sounded more like she was granting him a favor. "Is there a problem?" Daniel answered. "I'd like to speak with the purser." Lauren froze. Her pupils tightened in a brief flash of defensive instinct, a tiny but revealing signal of fear. She walked away, and a few minutes later, Mark Holloway appeared. His face carried a polite smile like a mask, but the skin around his eyes did not move at all. "I hear Ms. Pierce said you were dissatisfied." Daniel kept his tone calm. "I'm simply asking to be treated like every other passenger. I wasn't served a pre-departure drink, and the meal I selected was declared unavailable, even though I watched someone else receive it." Mark tilted his head, the smile on his lips cooling. "Our crew has full authority to determine the order of service and meal priority. If Ms. Pierce said the tenderloin was unavailable for you, then it is unavailable for you." Each word dropped like a verdict. Greg Thompson rose halfway from his seat, frustrated. "I haven't ordered yet. If he wants my meal, he can have it." "I don't mind." Mark cut him off, his voice dropping. "This does not concern you, Mr. Thompson." Then he leaned down toward Daniel and lowered his voice to a level only the two of them could hear. "People like you should know your place." That moment made Daniel sit upright, not out of fear, but because that sentence, painfully familiar, hit him like a ghost from the past, the same words he had heard as a boy stalked by grocery store security, simply because he did not look like a shopper. Yet now they said it to the man who was hours away from owning the entire airline. Anna Park dropped her pen, loudly, anger flashing in her eyes. Several passengers were starting to pay attention. A small shockwave moved through the cabin like a breeze before a storm. Daniel looked directly at Mark, unblinking. "I paid for first class. I'm only asking for what I paid for." Mark straightened his smile, stretching into something hollow. "If you continue to make this difficult, I will report your disruptive behavior to the captain." A cold spark lit in Daniel's eyes, subtle but unmistakable. He could see this had crossed a line, and Mark Holloway had just stepped over the one boundary he should never have crossed in his life, because the power he thought he wielded was about to become the trap that would snap back on him. Daniel knew it. It was only a matter of time before the truth tore the sky wide open. Mark Holloway walked away with the confidence of a man who believed he had just won, but Daniel knew one truth. Well, arrogance always creates openings, and Mark was exposing far too many. When he stepped into the galley, Daniel heard his voice rise without any disguise. "I'm reporting this to the captain." People like that never know how to stay quiet. The sound of a spoon hitting metal, the low muttering of crew members, all of it blended into a thick, murky noise, the sound of prejudice spoken freely. Daniel switched his phone to a second recording channel. His expression did not change, but behind those calm eyes, a tide was gathering. Anna Park leaned toward him and whispered. "Are you all right?" Daniel turned to her, his voice low. "I'm used to this, but being used to something doesn't mean accepting it." Anna nodded her eyes, carrying a weary kind of understanding. I've dealt with it too. Far too many times. A quiet pause settled between them, not from fear, but from the shared awareness that some things simply should not exist on an airplane, where everyone paid the same price, yet was not treated the same. The seatbelt sign suddenly lit up. Captain Eric Nolan's voice echoed through the speakers. "We are expecting light turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." But the footsteps in the aisle contradicted every word. 3 white passengers stood up and headed to the lavatory without being stopped. A young male attendant laughed with them as they passed. No one told them to sit. No one reminded them about the seatbelt sign. Daniel stood meaning to step into the lavatory, gather his composure, and quickly review the acquisition files on his phone, but he barely took 2 steps before Mark appeared out of nowhere, blocking him like a wall. Sir, the captain turned on the seatbelt sign. "You are not allowed to leave your seat." "But those passengers are still walking around," Daniel replied, his calm tone making Mark freeze for half a second. Mark straightened his shoulders, clinging to his fragile sense of authority. "I told you to sit down." The red glow of the warning lights reflected across Daniel's face. He looked at Mark for a long moment, weighing resistance against patience. In the end, he returned to his seat. Not out of fear, but because he realized something important. People like Mark were writing their own indictment, and all Daniel had to do was let them continue. A moment later, when the sign turned off, Mark disappeared into the cockpit. Daniel did not need to guess what he was reporting. And as expected, Captain Nolan soon appeared, his expression carved in the same mold as Mark's. "Mr. Carter," he said coldly, "I received a report that you've been disruptive and demanding special treatment." Daniel looked up, his voice calm enough to unsettle the captain. "I have not been disruptive. I only asked to receive the service I paid for in first class. If you want, I can provide evidence." Nolan frowned. Evidence of what? Daniel pointed to his phone. "I recorded everything." A short silence followed, just long enough for Daniel to see the tension tighten the captain's temples. "Recording is a violation of company policy," Nolan snapped his tone, revealing more insecurity than authority, the tone of someone realizing he had stepped across a line. Before Daniel could respond, another voice cut in sharp as a blade. "Recording discriminatory behavior does not violate any policy." Anna Park stood up, her gaze slicing through the heavy air. "I have video as well. And I'm not the only one." Several passengers began murmuring. Greg Thompson loosened his seatbelt and leaned forward. "I'll testify. Everything they said about you is a lie." Daniel felt the cabin shift, not because of turbulence, but because people were beginning to see the truth, a truth Mark and Nolan had tried to bury. Nolan looked around, recognizing something slipping beyond his control. He gritted out, "We will handle this. On this aircraft, the crew has full authority." Daniel met his eyes, and the captain had no idea that the look he received carried a secret powerful enough to change the fate of the entire airline. "You're right," Daniel answered softly. "But your authority only lasts until we land." In that moment, Daniel understood what Mark and Nolan could not. The more they tried to assert their authority, the more clearly they revealed who they were. The harder they pushed him down, the stronger the evidence against them became. And with every second passing, every word spoken, every gesture of contempt they threw at him, all of it was being recorded, marking the countdown to a storm that would consume their careers. No one else in the cabin knew it, but Daniel knew. That storm was no longer distant. It was forming in the silence, and it needed only a spark to ignite, a spark they themselves were creating minute by minute. Mark Holloway disappeared into the cockpit, carrying the hollow authority he believed he possessed. Only minutes later, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted, not because of turbulence, but because of a calculated silence curling through the air. Daniel knew exactly what was coming. When small men with small power feel their position slipping, they do the most dangerous thing: they band together. The cockpit door opened. Mark emerged with Captain Nolan following behind, both wearing expressions built entirely on fabricated confidence. Nolan stood before Daniel, hands clasped behind his back, eyes cold like the cockpit glass at night. "We have assessed the situation," he said, voice dropping into a practiced tone of authority. "You are threatening the safety of this flight. Upon landing, airport security will deal with you." The sentence was polished to sound official, but underneath it was nothing more than a verdict written from prejudice they believed would never be exposed. Anna Park shot to her feet, her voice stretched tight as a violin string. "He didn't do anything. In fact, you're the ones violating procedure." Greg Thompson stood as well, his voice echoing through the cabin. "Captain, I've flown first class for over 20 years. I have never seen treatment as unreasonable as this." Mark lifted an eyebrow with open disdain. "Sir, it would be best if you sat down." "This does not concern you." Greg's reply hit like a stone thrown at already cracked glass. "It concerns anyone who believes fairness is a basic value." The unexpected pushback made the entire cabin vibrate like a tightened string being pulled. But Nolan's expression did not change. He leaned close to Daniel, speaking quietly enough for only one person to hear, sharp enough to cut into anyone's dignity. "You have no authority here." Daniel met his eyes. His gaze held no anger, no fear, but a stillness so steady that Nolan hesitated for a brief beat. A flicker of light flashed in Daniel's eyes, the light of a man who knew the truth was on his side. "I have more authority than you think," Daniel said slowly. Nolan's brows twitched, as if the words were nothing more than an empty threat. Daniel did not elaborate. He did not need to. Men like Nolan never understood the power of silence. They believed only in the sound of their own voice, the sound of their title, the sound of the badge pinned to their chest. But Daniel carried a kind of power Nolan could not imagine, the kind that could reshape an entire system. The captain turned away, but Mark did not. He stared at Daniel with the look of someone trying to remind him that the sky belonged to them, that people like him only sat here thanks to some misguided stroke of luck. "I'll deal with security as soon as we land," Mark said coldly. "And trust me, they'll be on our side." Daniel did not reply. He simply watched Mark walk away, his shoulders trembling with misplaced triumph. But the very next moment, someone else approached. Not a flight attendant, not a passenger. A large man with a firm, deliberate stride. Federal Air Marshal Thomas Miller. He stopped in front of Daniel, his voice deep and clear. "Mr. Carter, I need to speak with you." Mark spun around immediately, triumph flashing across his face. "See, I called the Air Marshal. He'll take care of," but Miller raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence without even glancing at him. "I'm not speaking to you." Mark froze. The cabin fell silent. Miller sat beside Daniel. "The crew reported that you were disruptive, threatening, and demanding special treatment," he said. "I need your account from the beginning." Daniel recounted everything succinctly and precisely. No defensiveness, no embellishment, just the truth. As soon as he finished, Anna Park stepped in. "I have video." Greg Thompson added, "And I'm willing to testify." Each statement fell like a hammer against the rotting wood of the system Mark and Nolan represented. Air Marshal Miller looked around the cabin, his gaze thoughtful, then returned to Daniel. "I'm hearing too many inconsistencies in their reports. I'll proceed correctly." Mark opened his mouth, but Miller turned to him with a warning tone. "If your accusations are false, the consequences could be severe." Color drained from Mark's face, as though his confidence had been ripped away. Daniel watched without smiling. Some victories were not meant for celebration, not when they were built on years of personal pain. But he felt one thing clearly: the truth was finally shifting back into its rightful place. It was a small moment, quiet without applause or triumph, but deep inside Daniel, a massive door clicked open, the sound of fate beginning to turn. And only he knew that the shift ahead was far greater than anything anyone else in that cabin could imagine. The moment Air Marshal Thomas Miller walked away, the first-class cabin seemed to shift in color. Not because of lighting or weather, but because the illusion of power Mark and Nolan thought they possessed had begun to crack. Daniel felt it clearly, like a lake that seems calm on the surface, while heavy currents churn deep below. But that churning was not the climax. It was only the first warning. Mark returned to the galley, his voice tight with tension he tried to disguise as anger. "We need to get this under control before it gets out of hand," he growled at Lauren. "If we don't, we're the ones who'll be blamed." Lauren, who had been confidently dismissive all flight, suddenly lowered her eyes. "But the Air Marshal—" "I will handle it," Mark snapped. Each word fell heavy, like he was tightening a rope around his own neck without realizing it. Daniel watched through the narrow aisle leading into the galley. He could see Mark's back stiffen like sheet metal being heated to a dangerous point. They were no longer hiding their anxiety. Anxiety becomes fear. Fear becomes mistakes. And mistakes are the easiest things to expose. One unwritten rule of life: when people who discriminate realize they might get caught, they do not stop. They escalate. And right then a soft beep sounded through the cabin as the overhead speakers came on with Captain Nolan's voice, low, but carrying a faint tremor near the end. "Passengers and crew, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We are handling a security situation." The entire first-class cabin looked around, confused. No turbulence, no disturbance, no unruly passenger. Only one man had become the center of attention: Daniel. Greg Thompson sat up straight. "Security situation." I just stood up to adjust my bag. "Nothing happened?" Anna Park tightened her seatbelt, her eyes narrowing. They're manufacturing a reason, and Daniel knew they had reached the next phase, turning him into a threat. Mark stepped forward, wearing the expression of someone who believed he had just acquired legal immunity. "Mr. Carter, you must remain seated. The Air Marshal will continue questioning you once we land." "Where are you planning to land?" Anna demanded. Phoenix Mark replied. The cabin felt like it stopped breathing. Daniel leaned back, not out of fear, but because he understood these actions were not random. This was the rhythm of systemic discrimination. Invent a crime that does not exist. Push the victim into danger, then use regulations as weapons. He had seen it in banks, in schools, in boardrooms from his youth. And now it was happening again on an airplane 12,000 meters in the air. But what they did not know was that he was in the middle of finalizing the acquisition of Aurora Air. And the message he just felt vibrate in his pocket was the key. He pulled out his phone and saw the encrypted notification from his legal team documents ready to sign. Priority submission before landing. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. Just 1 second. Enough to connect everything. Aurora Air was riddled with discriminatory behavior. This crew was the living proof. And today, right now, they were helping him expose a system that had been rotting for years. When Daniel opened his eyes, his calm carried the sharp stillness of a mirror at the bottom of a lake. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. Mark lunged forward. "What are you doing? I told you to sit down." Daniel stared directly at him. "I need to use the restroom." "No. The aircraft is in emergency protocol." Behind him, Air Marshal Miller approached his voice, slicing the air clean in half. "Mr. Holloway, you may not restrict passenger movement unless there is an actual safety issue." Mark froze. Miller turned to Daniel. "Mr. Carter, you may go." Daniel nodded. "Thank you." The first-class lavatory had a sign taped to it, "Out of order." Daniel stared at it for 1 second, then let out a quiet, knowing laugh. He headed to the rear of the aircraft. There, the lavatory worked perfectly. Inside the small, bright cabin, he locked the door, took out his phone, opened the document, and placed his finger on the biometric sensor. Sign. A small green light appeared. A vibration. A message completed. Daniel Carter. % owner of Aurora Air. He looked at himself in the mirror. No longer the man Mark Lauren or Nolan felt free to insult. He was now the man who owned the very sky they stood in. And they were about to learn that in just a few minutes. He stepped out and returned to first class. His expression had not changed, but every step carried a quiet force that anyone watching could feel but not explain. Anna Park leaned toward him and whispered, "Are you all right?" Daniel sat down, his voice light as air yet heavy as stone. "I'm all right, and from here on everything changes." Anna did not yet grasp what he meant. Greg did not either. But the change was coming. Fast. Irreversible. And the very crew on this flight had just signed their own verdict without even realizing it. The plane shook lightly as it exited the fake turbulence Captain Nolan had invented, yet the tension inside first class did not fade. Instead, it thickened, heavy and unmoving, as if every breath carried the scent of a storm about to break. No one knew that the storm had already begun in the lavatory, where Daniel Carter had just signed the document that shifted the entire balance of power in the sky. Mark Holloway stepped out of the galley, his face pale with strain, even as he tried to cling to authority. He glared at Daniel, as though looking at a problem he needed to remove. "Mr. Carter." Mark said, his voice as stiff as steel. "You moved around while the seatbelt sign was still on. You're creating further complications for this flight." Daniel looked up. His calm gaze was so steady it made Mark falter. "The captain turned off the sign before I stood up," Daniel said, "and the air marshal approved my movement. Greg Thompson spoke immediately. I saw it. He didn't do anything wrong," Anna Park added. "And I have video." Mark felt the entire cabin shifting toward Daniel, not through shouting, not through confrontation, but through truth. And truth always made people who hid behind shaky walls of power begin to tremble. Yet Mark clung desperately to the last scrap of authority he thought he had. "The air marshal can be mistaken," he said, loudly trying to overpower the fear spreading inside him. "Flight safety is the responsibility of the crew, not passengers." At that moment, Federal Air Marshal Thomas Miller returned, standing directly behind Mark. Mr. Holloway Miller said, his voice low, but carrying absolute authority, "I am not mistaken, and I do not take orders from the crew." Mark turned stiffly, his voice cracking. "You are interfering with crew command. I am preventing you from abusing it," Miller replied. The silence after that sentence lasted only a second, but it was enough for the entire cabin to understand the illusion of absolute power that Nolan and Mark awarded themselves was beginning to crumble. The cockpit door swung open. Captain Nolan appeared, his demeanor sharp, tense, like a man who felt his authority being challenged. "We are diverting to Phoenix," he announced. "This situation is unsafe. I'm not discussing it further." Miller stepped forward half a pace. "Captain, I have not identified any threat. If you divert, you need a legitimate reason." Nolan clenched his jaw. "I have the purser's report." Greg Thompson stood so fast his seatbelt snapped back. "A false report." Anna added, "There is evidence." Daniel remained seated, not because he was defeated, but because he saw the one thing they didn't. Every rushed decision they made, every impulsive action, every careless sentence was turning them into living evidence for an investigation they did not yet know was coming in a matter of hours. Nolan glanced at Mark, searching for one last confirmation. Mark nodded vigorously, voice dripping with arrogance. "We need to protect the safety of this flight." At that instant, Daniel's phone vibrated in his pocket. One short notification. "Transfer complete. Board has acknowledged." Daniel raised his gaze. Something shifted in his eyes, something both Anna and Greg noticed, though neither understood fully. It was not defiance, not triumph, but the quiet certainty of a man who had just secured the final piece of the game. When he stood up, every small sound in the cabin disappeared. Captain Nolan Daniel said slowly, "You are acting based on a false report." Nolan scoffed with open disdain. "You have no authority to say that." Daniel looked at him, his gaze sharp enough to puncture the air. "I do, and in just a few minutes you will understand why." Nolan let out a hollow laugh, a laugh that echoed strangely in the tense cabin. "And who exactly do you think you are? Some entitled passenger?" Daniel did not blink. "No, I am the person you will be reporting to." The sentence hit the air so heavily it felt like the oxygen had thinned. Greg's mouth dropped open. Anna's eyes widened. Lauren froze where she stood, her face draining of color. Mark burst out laughing, but his laughter trembled thin and brittle like a man clinging to the edge of a cliff. "You're delusional," he spat. Daniel's reply came in a whisper, soft but earth-shattering. "I just signed the transfer for 51% of Aurora Air." Silence. No movement. No breath. Anna lifted a hand to her mouth. Greg whispered, "My God!" and Mark Holloway. He stood frozen like a statue, cracking from the inside. Nolan stared at Daniel, eyes darting, searching for a sign that this was a joke. But Daniel's eyes offered no humor, no doubt only truth. Truth Nolan could no longer escape. Daniel sat back down, his voice gentle as air yet striking as thunder. "When we land, you will not be escorting me into any interrogation room." A short pause. "I will be escorting you." And in that moment, suspended in the sky, amid the chaos they had created to crush one man, Daniel Carter became the storm's center, unstoppable and undeniable. The entire first-class cabin fell into a silence so deep it felt as if everyone could hear their own heartbeat. But that silence lasted only a few seconds before it was ripped apart by the final desperate attempts of people losing their power. Captain Nolan stood frozen in the aisle, his face shifting from red to white to a ghostly gray, like a man being dragged out of the cockpit in the middle of a storm. No, that's impossible," he stammered. "No one can buy an airline during a flight." Daniel looked at him with a calm so sharp It felt cruel, as if he were watching a man who had not yet realized the floor beneath him had vanished. "I didn't buy an airline during the flight," Daniel said. "I completed the acquisition during the flight." A simple sentence, but it struck directly at the one weakness Nolan and Mark had no defense against the truth. Behind him, Lauren Pierce's hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped her tray. Zach, who had assumed this entire flight was just another routine display of crew superiority, stared at Daniel like a fish out of water. But the most striking reaction came from Mark Holloway. He stepped back half a pace, struggling to swallow the lump stuck in his throat. You are lying," Mark said, but his voice sounded ready to break. "No one can do that." Daniel tilted his head. "Would you like to call the board of directors to verify no one moved?" No one spoke, because if Daniel said that, it meant he was not bluffing. Air Marshal Thomas Miller was the first to shatter the paralysis. He stepped forward, looking at Daniel, then at Nolan. "I need to verify this immediately. If it is true, then this is no longer a passenger issue." Nolan swallowed hard. "You have no authority. I have authority to investigate abuse of security reporting," Miller replied. "And if you filed a false report to justify an emergency diversion, you will be held accountable." Nolan felt his face burn. His entire career had been built on a simple pattern. The crew makes a claim, the captain confirms it, passengers stay silent. But this time the pattern was breaking. A passenger stood up. Not Daniel. Greg Thompson. "I want to make something clear," Greg said, his voice carrying the weight of experience and age. "I witnessed everything. If a statement is needed, I will sign it." A woman in the row behind him added, "Me too." Then another, and another. Like falling dominoes, passengers began to stand one by one. They were all witnesses. They had all seen. They all understood that this moment, the truth no longer belonged to Daniel alone. It belonged to everyone who had seen what happened. Air Marshal Miller nodded. "I will report this to Flight Security Headquarters. The crew is not to make any further accusations until we land." Mark shot up. "You cannot do that. I am the purser. You are the one under investigation." Miller cut in. "Sit down." For the first time in the entire flight, Mark Holloway had no reply. He sank into his seat, shoulders collapsing as if the air had been punched out of him. Captain Nolan looked around and saw he had no allies left, no authority left, nowhere to anchor himself. His gaze finally landed on Daniel, the man he had just tried to frame as a threat, the man he had disrespected, the man he believed did not belong in first class, the man who had just become the new owner of Aurora Air. Mr. Carter Nolan began grasping for the dignity he no longer had. Daniel did not let him finish. "I will make this very clear," Daniel said, his voice low but hitting like a hammer. "When we land, the crew will exit the aircraft first. I will work with the board of directors and the security division. Every report you filed, every action you took has been documented." Nolan swallowed. Daniel looked at him, not with anger or hatred, but with the cold truth of a man who had endured enough. "You are not controlling this flight anymore," Daniel said. "You are only controlling the remainder of your own mistake." The entire cabin held its breath. And then, the most unexpected thing happened. Chloe Ramirez, a trainee flight attendant of only 3 weeks, stepped forward with trembling hands. She looked at Daniel, then at Mark, then at Nolan. Finally, she gathered all her courage. "What Mr. Carter said is true. I saw everything. I was told to stay quiet, but I cannot keep silent." The cabin turned toward her. Daniel said nothing, only gave her a small nod, granting the permission she hadn't known she was seeking. Chloe continued, her voice shaking but clear. The way they served him, the way they treated him, it was not random. It is part of a culture that has been passed down in the crew. Nolan's face drained of colour. Mark looked hollowed out. Lauren gasped like someone hit hard in the chest. Chloe bowed her head, eyes red. "I am sorry for staying silent." Daniel replied softly, "Thank you. Courage does not arrive early. It arrives when it is needed." In that moment, everyone understood. The crew had not merely acted wrongly. They had not merely discriminated. They were the product of a flawed system that had gone unchallenged for years. A system that Daniel Carter, the man they had belittled, now had the power to change. And as the aircraft continued toward Phoenix, no longer under the control of Nolan's narrative, everyone knew the change was coming. Not in months, not in weeks, but the moment the wheels touched the ground, because the sky, from the moment Daniel signed the document, no longer belonged to them. It belonged to him. And justice was coming with wings. The atmosphere in the cabin began to change in a strange way. There was no longer the suffocating fear that Daniel would be dragged away. Instead, a silence stretched tight like a drawn string, the kind of silence that appears when the truth is closing in on people who have spent years hiding behind lies. Captain Nolan returned to the cockpit, while Mark Holloway sat like a man who had lost his sense of direction. His hands clenched so tightly the knuckles had turned white. Lauren Pierce stood, pressed against the wall, her face drained of colour, as if every word Chloe spoke had peeled back the layers she had used to cover her wrongdoing for years. But Daniel understood they were not done. People who rely on false authority do not collapse immediately. They struggle one last time, and that final struggle is always the most dangerous. As the plane continued toward Phoenix, Daniel felt the looks from behind him, suspicion, fear, anger, shame, all woven together in the tense air of first class. Anna Park quietly opened her laptop and began writing a report. Greg Thompson sat upright, elbow resting on the armrest like an old general, waiting for the moment to strike back at the injustice he had witnessed. Federal Air Marshal Miller sat near the forward exit eyes, sharp, watching everyone with the caution of a man who knew things were not yet safe. Daniel sensed all of it, but more than that, he felt the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat, slow and calm as though his entire being were preparing for a confrontation greater than any he had ever faced in the world of technology. This was not a battle of code or shares. This was a battle of dignity. Captain Nolan's voice returned over the speakers. It trembled slightly, though he tried to restrain it. "Attention passengers, we will be making an emergency landing in Phoenix under standard safety protocol. Airport security will be standing by to handle the incident." Incident. Greg shot upright. What incident? Miller rose and stepped into the aisle. "Captain Nolan," he said loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear, "I have identified no threat. I will report this the moment we land." Nolan did not reply. The cockpit door slammed shut. In that moment, Daniel saw clearly Nolan was not simply trying to defend himself. He was trying to protect an entire network of wrongdoing hidden behind doors passengers were never meant to see. They were approaching the ground. But before the crew could construct their version of events, Daniel knew he had to prepare. He opened his laptop. Digital documents loaded alongside the confirmation of his ownership transfer. Next to it was an email from the legal department. "The Phoenix team has been notified. Temporary command will shift to the board of directors if there is a conflict in orders. Another notification appeared. Operations Center requests verification of flight status. Captain's report does not match telemetry. Daniel allowed himself a faint smile. They were not alone. The truth was beginning to spread like light through a crack in a door, but then another alert froze his expression. Internal leak. Captain Nolan has multiple buried complaints. Purser Mark connected to 17 discrimination incidents removed from official reports. Daniel read the lines, his heart sinking with a familiar hurt, but rising with fresh resolve. Everything he had endured today was not random. It was the visible part of a much larger structure he had suspected for years, and it needed to be torn down from the root. The prepare for landing sign lit up. Daniel closed his laptop and switched his phone to recording mode, just in case. Miller approached and whispered, "Mr. Carter, when we land, let me go first. They may still try something." Daniel nodded. Greg placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You're not alone here. Remember that." Anna looked at him through the gap between the seats. Let the truth do its work. The airplane touched down with a firm jolt. The wheels screeched across the Phoenix runway. The cabin held its breath. The aircraft rolled to a stop, silence thick enough to feel. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Before the door could open, Mark Holloway jumped to his feet, grabbed the intercom, and shouted, with a trembling but authoritarian voice, "All passengers remain seated. No one is allowed to leave the aircraft until security." But he never finished. The speakers crackled with a new voice, calm and unmistakably firm. "Aurora Air Board of Directors requests temporary suspension of crew command until the situation on board is verified." Mark went still. Lauren covered her mouth. Zach froze in place, and Daniel simply closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though witnessing the first turn of a long-awaited wheel of justice. And this time, that wheel would not be turning back. The aircraft door opened slowly, and light from the jet bridge poured in like a stage where every main character, whether willing or not, was about to step forward. Phoenix had no dark clouds and no storm yet. Inside first class, the storm had reached its peak. Federal Air Marshal Miller stepped out first, his gaze sweeping across the scene, prepared to stop any act beyond proper authority. Right behind him, Daniel Carter rose to his feet. Not hurried, not shaken, not angry. He walked like a man who knew he was not just leaving an airplane, but walking toward a truth far larger than this moment, toward a change he had been fighting to bring into existence for half a year. But before he could step out, a group of airport security officers rushed in. The lead officer, a tall sergeant, spoke loudly. "Who is Daniel Carter?" Mark Holloway pointed instantly, his voice rising as if he had just found his final lifeline. Here this man caused a security disturbance, resisted the crew, and endangered the flight. It was the desperate cry of a man drowning and trying to pull someone else under with him. But this time, no one was throwing him a rope. The sergeant turned to Miller. "You're the air marshal on this flight, correct?" "What does your report say?" Miller answered without hesitation. Passenger Carter posed no threat whatsoever. "The accusations made by the crew are unfounded." Mark's mouth fell open, as if he had been struck across the chest. "You're going against the crew. I am upholding the law." Miller replied, each word as sharp as steel. Then he turned to the sergeant. "We have witnesses, multiple witnesses." At that moment, Greg Thompson stood in the aisle. "I will testify. I saw everything from start to finish. The person who was mistreated was Mr. Carter. Anna Park stepped forward. "And I have video." Another passenger raised a hand. "So do I. A fourth. A fifth." Their voices rose together like a tide, crashing through the dam Nolan and Mark had built out of lies. Captain Nolan stepped out of the cockpit, his face paler than the overhead lights. He tried to regain his tone, but his voice cracked with tremors he could not hide. "Everyone needs to calm down. This situation needs to be handled internally." Daniel stepped forward now, only a few steps from Nolan. Internally, he asked quietly. "You call filing a false report an internal. You call fabricating a security threat to force an emergency landing internal." Then Daniel said the sentence no one in the crew was prepared to hear. "I am the new owner of Aurora Air." Nolan stepped back half a pace. "No, that's impossible." Daniel raised his phone, the screen displaying the ownership confirmation and the board's directive. "It's entirely possible." The air inside the cabin changed instantly, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out. Mark Holloway let out a distorted, trembling laugh. "This is staged." A colored passenger, Greg, reacted immediately. "What did you just say?" Anna took a step forward. "Say that again." Mark choked on his words and backed away, but it was too late. That sentence was the final piece, confirming everything Daniel had endured in the air that day. And Daniel looked directly at him. "You just admitted what I no longer need to prove." Airport security looked at one another, then at Mark. One officer asked Miller, "How should we proceed?" Miller answered, "Detain the crew for investigation. They violated procedure and exhibited signs of abusing authority." Nolan stood frozen, as if struck by lightning. Lauren covered her mouth, tears streaming but too afraid to speak. Zach shook uncontrollably, like a loose door slamming in the wind. Chloe Ramirez, the only member of the crew brave enough to tell the truth, stood still, but looked at Daniel with a mix of fear and gratitude. Daniel gave her a small nod. A silent thank you. A recognition that one person's courage can save an entire life. Outside, a group of people in suits walked quickly down the jet bridge. Without needing introduction, Daniel recognized them representatives from the Board of Directors Operations Leadership and Chief Legal Counsel. Leading them was Evelyn Harper, Senior Counsel, who spoke directly and without hesitation. "We received the report about the incident on this flight. Mr. Carter, would you like to file a formal complaint right here and now?" Mark rushed forward. "No, this is a misunderstanding." This is Evelyn raised a hand. "Mr. Holloway, you are suspended immediately." Then she turned to Nolan. "And so are you." Nolan tried to speak, his voice shaking. "I followed protocol," Daniel replied. "What protocol allows you to fabricate a security threat?" Evelyn turned to airport security. "Escort them to the interrogation room." Mark shouted, "You can't do this to me." Evelyn cut him off, cold as ice. "You are no longer crew, and you do not have the authority to speak to us that way." As Mark and Nolan were escorted away, Daniel stood there watching them go. Not with delight, not with revenge, but with the quiet recognition that something which should have ended long ago was finally ending. Arrogance, built on prejudice. A new flight attendant stepped onto the aircraft, young, steady, composed. "We will continue this flight to Los Angeles," he announced. Under the direction of the Board of Directors, Greg placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "My God, you just saved this entire flight." Anna smiled softly. "Not just the flight. You saved an entire system." Daniel looked out the window and saw Phoenix stretched across the landscape like a golden desert under the sun. A strange feeling rose in his chest, both light and heavy, like a door closing and another opening. He turned back to the passenger strangers who had stood up for the truth. "No," Daniel said. "We saved one another." And as he stepped off the aircraft, the light outside was no longer just runway light. It was the light of a new chapter. A chapter where justice was not luck, but choice. A chapter where biased words were no longer an unspoken rule in the sky. A chapter where people like Daniel Carter, people who had been underestimated, misjudged, pushed aside, finally stood where they deserved to stand. And as he walked through 2 lines of Aurora Air employees, bowing their heads, not for money, not for power, but for genuine respect, Daniel understood one thing clearly. The change he was bringing was not carried in his hands alone. It had been ignited in the hearts of everyone who witnessed the truth today. A flame no one could extinguish, and from that moment on, the sky of Aurora Air would never be the same again. From the perspective of an expert in organizational culture and systemic power, Daniel Carter's story reveals a timeless truth. What collapses a company is rarely a single major mistake, but the small, everyday distortions that are quietly normalized. A prejudiced remark, a manipulated procedure, a buried report, all of these combine to form a culture capable of turning anyone into a victim. Daniel did not prevail because he was wealthy, nor because he held authority. He prevailed because he remained steadfast, because he chose to stand up at the exact moment when most people choose silence. And that choice is what changed an entire system. If this story resonates with you, please like and subscribe to help spread the spirit of justice and kindness. Before you leave the video, comment exactly 3 words: "Justice comes first." This is more than a phrase, it is a reminder that change always begins with the way we treat one another.